Good afternoon and welcome. Now, if you're like me, there's a moment late in each year where the arrival of a little booklet causes a stir of excitement. I am referring to the program guide of the next Sydney Festival. Let's face it, as all of our orchestras and theatre companies all start winding down for the summer, my cultural summer is pretty much owned by the Sydney Festival. And certainly some of my most surprising and engaging experiences have come via the Sydney Festival platform. So it's with great excitement that I'm able to introduce to you today Lieven Bertels, who's the new director of Sydney's greatest cultural party, whose first Sydney Festival will kick off this coming summer. Now, of particular interest to music types such as myself is that we have a genuine music type at the helm of our premier festival, and a serious music type at that. Lieven studied both musicology and composition, both in Belgium and the UK. As a lecturer, he's headed up the audio department of the Brussels Film, Television and Radio School, and producing numerous programs for radio. He's also largely credited for overseeing the revitalisation of the Bruges Concertgebouw in his role as artistic director of that organisation, and more recently was the artistic coordinator of the Netherlands' oldest and most prestigious festival, the Holland Festival. So Lieven's artistic leadership in these varied roles has often been marked by a successful uniting of various threads of cultural expression. For example, bringing together art music with popular music, with non-Western music, for example. And I believe today's lecture will trace some links between early experimental developments in electronic music, from the likes of Karl-Heinz Stockhausen and co., through to more contemporary forms of electronic music today. So I would like to introduce to you Lieven Bertels.
Electronic music. I hope you can all hear me clearly. If that's all right, we are ready to fly. About lab codes, sound acrels, and whirlute. Now, what's that about? Let's look at that history of electronic music. What is electronic music first and foremost? We might want to give ourselves a little definition if we want to. Electronic music, we can have all kinds of definitions, but I would say is all that music that is not produced acoustically. That's a very broad blanket kind of definition. And of course, there isn't one single clear starting point for electronic music as such. There's a number of starting points for electronic music, and some are very surprising. But in general, we tend to, in musicology and in music history, tend to speak about the period of electronic music broadly speaking as the period after the Second World War, when three important centers for electronic music really started, or three cultures of electronic music, and that's what I refer to in the title. So I will come to those three important centers for electronic music after the Second World War in a second. But I would like to point at a number of individual starting points before that. There were a number of attempts mostly by individuals, not so much by institutions, to build instruments and to broaden the sonic spectrum of music, if you want, with either instruments or new instrumentation techniques. And we can look at a number of those before we actually go into the history proper of electronic music. The three sort of major streams of electronic music as we know it were starting in France, in Germany and in the USA, and are referred to as Musique, concrète, elektronische Musik, and music for magnetic tape. And all of them, funnily, at exactly the same time. All of them actually started in 1948. All of them took about 5 years to develop. And all of them actually pretty much independent from each other. Not that they didn't know about each other, but they were very independent. But what were those proto-developments? What were the developments before these three major streams? One was the invention of a number of individual electronic instruments or electric instruments. One was certainly the emancipation of noise as musical material. One was the development of non-conventional notation, and of importance for all of those three streams actually was the cultural development of Dadaism and its crossover from visual arts into performing arts. Now we can look at a number of the individual electronic instruments that were developed before we speak about electronic music as such. Some of them have really funny stories. For instance, Thaddeus Cahill, when he developed the telharmonium or the dynamophone, was actually looking for a way to make money out of the invention of the telephone exchange. After Bell had invented the telephone system as we know it today, two wires going from one house to another, with an exchange in between, and in the early days, as we remember from black and white movies, I don't think there's anybody in this audience that remembers that from their own experience. I would hope not. But in the early days, apparently you had to call the exchange, and there would be a lovely lady at the exchange taking your call and then putting you through to the person you wanted to speak to. And it was a very exclusive thing. In my country, where I come from, the original first telephone exchange had 100 subscribers. And the price for an annual subscription was about the average wage of an average person in their entire life, to give you an idea of the cost of phoning somebody. So if you talk about early adopters in technology, those existed in those days as well. The Belgian king had phone number 001 in that first phone exchange. Now, what Thaddeus Cahill in the United States found out was that most of the time your phone line was sitting there empty, it was not being used. And so he came up with a clever business model of saying, what if I were to use that phone line to bring piped music into your house? And so what he invented was basically a huge collection of dynamos that produced sine tones before we had any other form of electrical sound generation, already in the 19th century. And he was going to use it as a big electric organ that basically he invented the synthesizer, he invented the sequencer, he invented all these things without knowing he did, and it failed massively. Because he built it, and we have a couple of recordings actually of late versions of dynamophones. The problem was that it interfered with the actual phone exchange, and so you also got that lovely music that he was selling to people that subscribed to the series if you hadn't subscribed, or if you were trying to make a phone call. So they had to get rid of that system because it was extremely powerful. We were talking of watts and watts of power being piped into the phone system, not very successfully. But one of the first demonstrations of what he could do, and we have to remember this is still in the 19th century, people were still going around in carts and horses, was that he was able to stage a concert in a theater, and people were listening to it down the road in a hotel about 2 kilometers away. And that was actually quite extraordinary in those days. Instruments that are perhaps better known from that period, roughly that period, are the ondes Martenot, invented by the French Maurice Martenot, as we know it, for instance, from some of the music of Olivier Messiaen. The Theremin, you know, the antenna where you go closer to the antenna and you produce a sound, and depending on your distance to the antenna and the height, you can change the volume and the pitch of that sound. The Trautonium, which was a sort of early electric organ, if you want, or a synthesizer, by Friedrich Trautwein in 1933. The Hammond organ, which found its way into gospel and blues, which debatably is actually an electroacoustical instrument, like the Rhodes electric piano, because you do have physical vibration to create electrical vibration that you then amplify and pick up and send through a loudspeaker, similar to the electric guitar. It's quite amazing that all of this is fairly recent history. Most of these inventors only died recently. Les Paul, the person who actually sort of invented the electric guitar, I saw him a couple of times with his jazz trio at the Iridium Jazz Club in New York. He only died 2 years ago. The Chamberlin tape organ is a very fascinating instrument because it was the first sampler. What it was just after the invention of magnetic tape, somebody built an organ where each key was triggering a little tape loop of analog tape. And you could record whatever sound on that, so basically you had a sampler. And it found its way into pop music. I'm going to play you a little example of the Trautonium, played here by Oskar Sala, one of the great heroes of that instrument. I have to say it's not the earliest version of the instrument, because he actually has a double keyboard Trautonium with a number of extra effects added to it. But it gives quite a good idea of the sonic qualities of that instrument. It's fascinating to see how it not only deals with new sounds but also with new ways of playing, and that's one of the explorations we see in a lot of these early developments, is that people were not just looking for new sounds but also for new ways of engaging with technology. So the human instrument interface changed, and the way we think about how we control the interface and how we control the player playing with the interface changed as well, which basically is the musical notation system we use. Another important element, as I pointed out, was the emancipation of noise. Suddenly noise became, not suddenly actually, gradually noise became part of our musical language. And it started in late Romantic music, as we know, with all kinds of nature effects. And even before that, First we had what the Greek referred to as mimesis, the copying of nature, and then we had the creation of nature, if you wanted, in late Romantic music, and you started to have instruments that weren't really instruments that were mimicking nature, but were instruments to be nature, as in thunder sheets and big wind machines. Like we still see them in theater effects, but we had them in the symphonic orchestra. And then we had the whole futurist movement, the pre-fascist futurists, like Luigi Russolo, that devised all these crazy instruments, the intona rumori, literally noise instruments, around 1913 and leading into the 20s. Instruments that he wanted to use to emancipate noise to the level of musical language. And of course, all the way up to the Second World War, when the young John Cage started to use really original source material for his imaginary landscapes, he was using RCA test records. This is before the time of LPs. This was old 78 RPM discs, test discs, that he would use as musical source material. So if we talk about found objects in visual arts, there were found objects, if you want, in music as well. This was a good example of a found object. There was all kinds of interest from the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century in unconventional notation. People started to think, well, hang on, if I'm using this traditional musical notation, how can I write those things that don't fit on an instrument? How am I going to write beyond just percussion notation? And sometimes it had to do with ideas of synesthesia, the connection between different forms of perception, different senses. For instance, Scriabin was very much occupied with some form of synesthesia. And he wrote for an instrument he had built for him, which was basically a light organ, not a light organ as in a control desk to control theater lights, but actually a keyboard that would control different colors. And he wrote color-coded scores for this clavier à lumière, a light organ, to sort of create a light music, if you want. The futurists started to devise graphical scores where they would use lines and a graphical notation with time evolving horizontally, and to have lines on that time graph, which is pretty much what the early electronic music after the while would use, either to describe a piece of electronic music for the listener or for the musicologist that took interest, or to actually make the piece. There's two forms of graphical notation that we could both call a score, but that mean two different things in electronic music. One is a score to actually be able to enjoy the piece if you want, or to follow it, and another one is a set of instructions to execute some form of the piece, and both existed as graphical notation. And then of course there was basically to do with the emancipation of noise, but very much a separate and very important cultural movement in Europe in the first half of the 20th century. There was Dadaism. And within Dadaism, that we know of course, through visual arts, there was also an important place for sound art and for poetry that was Dadaist in nature and that emancipated noise and nonsensical sounds to a level of music, with an important first example in Kurt Schwitter's Urlaut Sonata. Urlaut meaning a sort of primal scream. So it's a sonata made up of nonsensical primal sounds with a strict sonata form, but non-musical material. And he performed that and refined that Urlaut Sonata for over a number of years. Play a little bit of a very rusty recording of Luigi Russolo's Intonare Mori in a kind of weird combination with conventional instruments. He wrote a chamber concerto kind of thing. And I do apologize, but I've really edited all of those examples to sort of a 1 minute length to give you some taste for it, which is a good thing if you don't like it, but it's a bad thing if you really have an interest. But most of them are from public domain sources, so you can actually find these examples afterwards on the internet if you want. Now let's go to the sort of the real history of electronic music. Which started at sort of the same moment, so it's a bit unfair to actually claim that this, that or the other was first. So for no other reason than randomness, I've chosen to speak about Musique, concrète first. Musique concrète was a development in the French radio environment, and it was started by Pierre Schaeffer. Pierre Schaeffer was actually starting this quite remarkably during the Second World War. He was originally from the eastern part of France, German-speaking part of France, the Alsace region, from Strasbourg, and he moved to Paris. And for the radio and television, it later became radio and television because there was no television in 1942 in France, but it's referred to as the Radio and Television of France RTF Studio, or Club d'Essai. So it was a club of the trial and error, if you want. It was a research group within the French radio station, originally attached to the Orchestre de Radio France, the orchestra of the radio, and it started in 1942. And for some reason, in English language sources, very often Pierre Schaeffer gets quoted as the first person that invented tape sampling. But that's actually historically not correct, because he did invent sampling, but he wasn't using tape, because in 1942 in France there was no tape recorders. There were no tape recorders. He was actually using an extremely crazy technique of sampling on recording lathes. So he was cutting records, 78 RPM records, and he was sampling sounds of these records in all kinds of cunning physical ways, as in taking a razor blade and cutting the groove to make the needle jump and skip bits of the sound, which was an extremely tedious way of actually editing sound. So he would record sound. He was one of the first to actually discover that musical sounds have a transient and have an attack, and he would and a sustained part, things we know use in analysis or we use in synthesis, but nobody had really given any thought to that. And so he discovered that if you take a piano recording of a single note and you take a clarinet recording of a single note, and if you cut off the attack of the same note, same pitch in unison of both those instruments, that they actually sound very similar. So without having elaborate harmonical analysis equipment, he could sort of guess that there was something to the recipe of an actual sound, as in harmonics. We understood the theory of harmonics long before that. People knew about the physics of sound, obviously, but we hadn't actually used that in practice, and he was one of the first. But as I said, in a very tedious kind of way, it was extremely difficult for him to play around with those sounds. And one of the first things he discovered was that it was actually far more rewarding to work with real-life sounds than to work with clinical musical sounds. And he set up this research group together with his assistant, Pierre-Henri, a percussionist, slightly his junior. And after those first 10 years, they set up what they called the Groupe de Recherche de Musique concrète, concrete music, music that was dealing with real sounds. And so they were making music with existing sound material. That was very much their aesthetic credo, if you want. Now, musically, if you look at what they did structurally with the music, they were very much influenced by what was going on in Paris around that time anyway. So major influences were people like Nadia Boulanger and Olivier Messiaen and his wife, Loriot. People who were very interested in new sounds. Loriot was the famous Aude Martineau player in most of Messiaen's pieces, and a piano teacher. And it's amazing to see who were the students of those composition classes around there, because a lot of them went on to invent other electronic music and would actually not refer to this original source very often. People like Boulez, who was of course staying in Paris and very loyal to his teachers, but also people like Karl-Heinz Stockhausen and Karl Guyvaerts. Karl Guyvaerts, young Belgian composer, aged 23 then, was picking up some of the ideas that he then used in 1952, 1953 to develop the very first piece of fully serial music. He wrote the first serial music piece in Germany when he was on one of those famous music holidays in Darmstadt, where they had these summer courses. I'm going to play the first important piece that Pierre Schaeffer did in his studio, which was a study for railway-related sounds. So he took a big recording device. We're not talking about a small pocket-sized recorder. He had to take a cutting lathe, which weighs about 70 kilograms, to a railway station to do this recording, and then bring that recording home and cut it, splice it, but there wasn't really tape splicing, as I explained, and use multiple copies of the same record, play them all at once, and make this piece, which was called a railway study. So that was France. Karl-Heinz Stockhausen always denied he had anything to do with Musique, concrète, because he was thinking of himself as the god of electronic music, and he invented it all. So that's not exactly true, because he actually studied with Schaeffer and made a Musique concrète study before he even started in Germany, which he always denied until somebody found it in an archive and got it up, which is quite funny. But that's how Stockhausen was very much, all the way through to the end of his life, as we experienced many times at the Holland Festival, where he had lots of premieres. I'll talk a little about that later when we have refreshments. Elektronische Musik, electronic music, was really a different beast. Different aesthetics, different background. In Cologne being a city that had been completely bombed, almost completely bombed in the Second World War, had to piece itself together physically, culturally, morally, in many ways after the war. And one of the things that kept the Germans going was their extreme belief in science as the future. And that's really what this music radiated. It was not so much looking at the past and looking at cultural heritage. It was looking at the future, and that's where the lab coats refer to in my title. These were people running around in spick and span, newly built premises of the Westdeutsche Rundfunk, the German radio, looking at the future and looking how they could integrate technology into those futuristic models. So the first people in those radio stations that actually were dealing with music were not musicologists or musicians. They were mainly people coming from speech research, from radar technology, those kind of areas, including somebody called Werner Meyer-Eppler and another chap called Herbert Eimert. And they set up this experimental studio of the West German radio in Cologne. And they were very fascinated by an American invention called the vocoder from Bell Telephone Labs, which was a speech analysis machine that you could also use to alter speech and to analyze what components speech had. Now, they let composers play around with that for a little while, and one of the first to lay their hands on that lab was Bruno Maderna, who made one or two pieces there, experimental pieces, very fascinating pieces, and not pieces that Stockhausen liked a lot, because they were already going into a direction of combining live instruments with electronic sounds. And the young Stockhausen, when he walked into that lab and claimed it very much, because he was walking in and saying, "This is my turf, now you get out and go play somewhere else." The young Stockhausen wanted a strictly serial electronic music. Serialism was something he was building at that time with a couple of mates, including Karel Guivaerts again. They'd taken Messiaen's theories about the emancipation of rhythm and of volume dynamics, and they built this really tightly knitted, very tightly structured musical system of fully serial music, and this strict serialism was ideal for electronic sounds, or the other way around, electronic sounds were ideal for strictly serial music, because you could control all these parameters and you could make sure that the prime ingredients were absolutely pure and scientific. So they wanted to work with these sine waves because they were so pure. And they wanted to sort of go back to a sort of absolutely objective music, if you want. Total objectivism in music was what they were striving for. There's lots of stories of how young Karl-Heinz ran that studio. He looked very charming, almost like Tintin, but he was a bit of autocrat in that studio. And he didn't really enjoy other people having any success in the studio either. There's a famous story of him having created one of his first electronic studio pieces in 1953. And John Cage was attending the summer class in Darmstadt, which was the gathering of all these young composers in that time. And Cage already had a bit of a reputation. And so there were a couple of young students that wanted to play their electronic piece to Cage when he was coming. And so they all gathered in the studio, and the tape machines they had, because they were working with tape, not with cutting lathes, were these open reels like flanges which hold the tape. Broadcast tape didn't have two flanges, so it was like a pancake of magnetic tape basically. And so when Stockhausen was putting the first tape on the machine that held 5 pieces they had compiled to play to John Cage, he accidentally tripped and dropped the whole tape on the floor, ended up in spaghetti, and sadly Cage couldn't stay long enough, so they couldn't rewind that, so he could only play his own piece, which Cage got to hear and then commented on in the class the next morning. That's the sort of little histories about that man. This was the piece he played to John Cage. That's a very short snippet from that study number 2. So, meanwhile, in the US, something completely different happened. Again, it started in 1948, and again, there were people that were laying the path and then other people walking it. And the people starting it all were actually somebody from the military a young soldier, John T. Mullin, and a very rich crooner, Bing Crosby. And what's the connection to electronic music? Well, it's this, that John Mullin was sent to Europe at the end of the Second World War to actually survey all of the advanced technology that the Germans had employed during the war. Because what they had found out during the period 1943-1944 was that there was something odd going on in Nazi Germany with audio technology. One of the things they found out was that whenever people tried to bomb a radio studio where they knew for sure Hitler was in because he was giving a speech there, they didn't get Hitler. And that was because audio technology was so well advanced that they had invented this thing called tape recording that nobody really knew about. And the quality of tape recording was so much better than recording on records, on record lathes. People were so used to the crackle of a recording that they would think that that voice would have been live. And they actually started to see a pattern where major speeches were given from places in different time zones almost consecutively. And they started to think, how does that work? Because it couldn't have been long distance lines that didn't work that well. Or even if they would bomb the lines, the transmission would still go on. So in 1944, John Mullin, when actually studying radar installations, somewhere in a small place outside of Frankfurt, he found a small radio studio with 3 of the first tape recorders. And actually, if you look into that history more in detail, it's very fascinating. Not only did these Germans have tape recorders, they already had stereo tape recorders in the very early days. There's a famous stereo recording of the young Herbert von Karajan conducting what was left of the radio orchestra in October 1944. This is, you have to imagine, this is when the Führer was fleeing to his bunker. The radio orchestra was still recording Bruckner symphonies with soldiers that had lost their legs but could still hold a violin in a radio studio in Berlin. And if you play that tape now, it's not only in stereo, but you can hear the bombs falling in the background. It's quite a fascinating piece of history. In many ways, it's fascinating because, of course, the young von Karajan denied he had anything to do with the Nazis. Not true. He was there. He was their star young conductor. He didn't know. That's what he claimed. Secondly, of course, it's fascinating to see that they would use that top technology for something, as we would say, silly as the arts. They were using that top technology to do experiments with stereo music recordings. And thirdly, because they had all that quality and had it up and running when the whole military apparatus was falling apart at the end of the Second World War. But the Americans come in, they find these tape recorders, and they shipped, in total they found 12 of them between Frankfurt and Berlin, and they shipped 12 of them back to the US, and that formed the basis for the invention of the American tape recorder, the first Ampex machine in 1948. And it was Bing Crosby, actually, who was then not only an important crooner, but also an important radio host, who said, I'm tired of doing 39 weeks of season, because a radio season was 39 weeks, and you had to do it live. He had tried to do it from records, but his fans complained that the sound quality wasn't the same. And so it was under pressure from his fans that they said, you have to do it live, and he didn't agree. He said, I've got all the money in the world, I'm a rich artist, I want technology to advance so that I can take my holidays whenever I please. And so he saw some value in this German invention and gave a research fund to John Mullin together with a partner to set up Ampex and to build the first American tape recorder. Now, one of the first studios in the US to actually have a tape recorder, and I think it was actually a German one, I don't think they were working on an Ampex as first, was a very odd couple, Louis and Bibi Barron in New York. They were film composers, they were trained as classical composers, and they set up the first electronic music studio in the US, which typically in the American way was a private enterprise with a business model and with an idea to make some money. And some of their first clients were actually avant-garde composers, nutcases like Morton Feldman and John Cage. Now, there wasn't much money to be made on John Cage, I can tell you. So they quickly diversed into Hollywood, and they actually did the first soundtrack, fully electronic soundtrack to a sci-fi movie, which was Forbidden Planet in 1956, which has this cult status of being the first fully electronic soundtrack. But they were also the people that gave their tape recorders, because they had, I think first they had one and then they had three, to John Cage to do Williams' mix in 1953. Now, the one thing we have to, something I haven't spoken about so far is, what was the audience for this kind of music? Where did it get airplay, if you want? Now, in the first two instances, both in Paris and in Cologne, they would force feed this to an audience late at night on radio. So the first electronic music concert was a bit of Musique concrète in Paris in 1948, and Imert and Epler did similar concerts around 1951, and then subsequently in the following years there were regular electronic music concerts in Germany as well on the West German radio. With John Cage, it was very much an affair for live concerts. So I'm going to play you a little bit of Forbidden Planet and a little bit of Williams' mix, but not so much to hear the piece Williams' mix, but also to hear the interesting audience response when it was first played in concert. Because it's actually an early stereo recording. There was a stereo experiment done of the original tape, which was, I suppose, a mono piece being played, but they recorded it live in concert in the hall, so you also hear the applause at the end. First, a bit of Forbidden Planet. I love the word amazing on that sleeve. It was amazing. There was a lot of these connections between film and early electronic music. I should have pointed out the guy that played the Trautonium in that beautiful little clip, Oscar Sala. He also did the sounds for Hitchcock's Birds. That was another one of those examples of a connection. A little bit of Williams' mix. It is stereo. So far, so good. So, not very dissimilar to the audience response after the Rite of Spring or the iconic and historical first performances. And I think something John Cage experienced quite a few times in his life. So, where does that lead us in the rest of the development? I'm making a big jump here, a leap into more contemporary types of music. Not contemporary, but at least a 20-year jump, because there was a whole development out of those three streams. But to try to come to some kind of connection with today, I would like to give a couple of examples of where these three streams have led to. This is not an exhaustive list, and it's not a totally historically correct list, as in that some of the examples I quote here actually have multiple sources of inspiration, so let that be clear. Also, it's important to note that whilst those two European streams of early electronic music, the Musique concrète with those found objects, and the very pure, or at least in the onset, very pure electronic music of the Germans, were very much aesthetically opposed. The third one was very much found itself at liberty to take any aesthetics it needed. John Cage was doing John Cage music with tape, but the tape was not about the tape was about yet another means to try and work with some of the methodology he was exploring. So Williams' mix, for instance, is as much a music piece as it is cut-up poetry, and he was using the same tape machine that William Burroughs was using to do his cut-up poetry as well, and it's a cut-up piece. Williams' mix basically is a number of seemingly random recordings that you cut up and then splice back together with I Ching randomness methods. So it was a very different aesthetics to any of those two. But Musique concrète had a number of direct influences that we cannot ignore. The idea of sampling, and that's often what Musique concrète is quoted for, was used in a lot of subsequent developments of electronic music, both in the more academic and serious fields and in popular music. In more serious music, one of the first ones to actually use this was Harry Birtwistle, and I'm thrilled to say I'm actually going to bring the original 4-channel version of this piece, Chronometer, to the Sydney Festival. You'll be able to go and enjoy this as an installation. It's a little sneak peek here because we haven't announced it publicly, but there you go. I'm going to create an installation on George's Heights in Mosman, where you can relax on beanbags from sunrise onwards, and hear the 25-minute iconic electronic music piece, Chronometer, by Harry Birtwistle, which we thought was lost. Until 4 years ago, we thought that the original 4-track version was lost, and I found it in a barn somewhere in the countryside in East Sussex with a young DJ. It's a long story, but he had inherited these tapes from the National Theatre in London, because they were rotting away in a cellar in the National Theatre on the Thames riverbank. And somebody basically checked them out, and somebody else had found them, but he didn't know it was the one and only surviving piece of electronic music by Harry Birtwistle. So it's now on a DVD, and it's safe, and it's back with Universal, his publisher, where it belongs. But you can also buy it off the shelf now. But you can go and listen to it in its full surround glory, because it was not just one of the first pieces to use digital sampling, thanks to his then mate Peter Zinoviev, who was the builder of one of the first electronic studios in the UK, and also the builder of the beautiful VCS3 synthesizer. But it was also one of the first pieces to explore quadrophony in electronic music. A more popular example is actually Yoko Ono and the Beatles doing Revolution 9 on the White Album, very much against the advice of Paul McCartney, who said that this was crazy and it shouldn't be on the album. But John and Yoko pushed it, and it's actually the longest track on that album, at 8 minutes 45. And it's a pure piece of musique concrète. It's basically concrete found sound objects mixed and spliced together. And in the exposing of electronic music to a big audience, quite an important piece, because more than 8 million people bought the first release of that album. So more than 8 million people, probably at one time or other, listened to this piece, which is very different from the numbers of the first electronic music pieces on French radio, because they reckon there were about 120,000 people listening to that. Pink Floyd, of course, not only used synthesized music, but also found sounds. It also influenced soundscape art. Artists like Bill Fontana, who made pieces with both live and sampled sounds that you could experience dislocated from their original source. He did these famous ear bridges between cities where you could hear the boats of San Francisco Harbor on a square in Cologne, or you could hear the bell tower of Cologne in San Francisco Harbor, which was then very fancy and expensive because you had to have a very expensive satellite link to be able to do that. No, you just Skype your uncle somewhere else and they'll send you the sound. But also hip-hop, which is about sampling and stealing other people's sounds, or human beatboxers like Reggie Watts, who use little sound delays and digital delays to actually sample their own voice and make music out of that. Again, a couple of examples. This is Revolution 9, sorry, it should have said Revolution 9. It's not very different from early concrete music pieces from France. Actually, Pierre Schaeffer, together with Pierre Henry, did a symphony for a single man, Symphonie pour un homme seul, which was exactly this, with sounds related to mankind. Of course, we know this one. Again, not very different from the railway piece by Schaeffer, creating rhythm with found objects.
Hip-hop is based on the knowledge of records, and its fundamental beginnings and foundation is based on the knowledge of records. So whenever you hear a Nas get down on something like a piece of President or a little break beat in wherever, today's audience might not know exactly what the root was, but they've heard that sound somewhere before. I think the beauty about rap is that it made up a large part for its lack of melody with its sense of reminder.
What was my vision was to have this group be kind of like a production assembly line. There's going to be a time when we're going to have a nice little groove where Keith is going to be also we're going to have to go and I'm going to be like, and so we're all together. There's this one little moment that it all just meshes together in a nice vibration. All right, that little moment we then snatched.
But also the elektronische Musik, the electronic music from Germany, had quite an influence on a lot of people. Some really strange guys like Raymond Scott. Raymond Scott, just to mention him quickly, made his fortune in writing band music for the Looney Tunes cartoons. Well, he didn't write it for that, it was just used for that, and he got paid the royalties, and with that money he built his own electronic music studio in New York and his own instruments. Bruce Haag, similar case, sort of weird early hippie, building his own electronic instruments and making electronic music for children mainly. And then of course the whole synthesizer pop when people like Robert Moog and Peter Zinoviev started to build commercially available synthesizers that you could actually carry around, like the Moog synthesizer or the VCS3, those kind of things. And when people started to use them, to either use them as conventional instruments, like Wendy Carlos, when he/she started to do these renditions of Johann Sebastian Bach music, or people like Kraftwerk, Tangerine Dream, Vangelis, Jean-Michel Jarre, all that symphonic electronic music of the late 60s and early 70s. But then also in the 80s, dance music, techno, trance, and the whole electronica world, very much influenced by that. Kraftwerk is often quoted, but they're certainly not the only ones. This is a very early piece. Just some guesswork. What's the age difference between those two pieces, you think? Any idea when the Raymond Scott was created? That was 1953. And Kraftwerk, this one was 1976. So there's 25-year difference, and those pieces are very much aesthetically the same. And of course, magnetic tape had major influences as well, although because it wasn't one single aesthetic, those differences aren't perhaps as clear-cut as some of the others. But certainly, Steve Reich wouldn't have done his pieces if John Cage hadn't done the works prior to that. People like Tristram Cary, of course, who was actually developing the Peter Zinoviev studio that Harry Birdwhistle used for Chronometer, and then moved to Australia after that. And he was the person that actually put me on, gave me the lead to find that tape again, and then died just after it, so he never actually heard the end result, sadly. A lot of the West Coast pop music was influenced by that magnetic tape, as well as sampling, but certainly the Beach Boys, to an extent Frank Zappa. A lot of ambient music was influenced by it, Brian Eno or the French duo Air. And certainly the more recent developments such as glitch music, the whole cut and mix breakbeat developments, or all the lo-fi we know. People like Christian Markley, which Sydney has just rediscovered as a visual artist with his Clock project, but who first and foremost was a sound artist, or is a sound artist, and a very good guitarist actually. Somebody like Richard D. James, Aphex Twin, or Tekra, these kind of people. I'm going to play a little Aphex Twin to give you an idea of where that went to, and that's the end of my lecture. And just to say that this piece is in many more ways related to John Cage because it's also directly referencing his sonatas and interludes for prepared piano. Drugs, the album that this track comes from, actually has a beautiful cover where you see the inners of a piano, and most of the songs almost have that gamelan quality of the sonatas and interludes. So it's actually full circle if you know that he also released that album as an LP at a time when everybody said vinyl was dead. Of course, vinyl is back now. But certainly a couple of years ago when vinyl wasn't back yet, he released it as a 180 grams, really beautifully pressed, expensive collector's LP set. So you were almost buying a piece of history and a piece of the musical flavor of the day at the same time. Thank you very much. I hope you've enjoyed this, and thanks for being here.